Welcome to Another Education is Possible. This is Jordan, and today's guest is Roozbeh Shirazi. This is kind of an emergency episode, maybe like our version of an emergency episode. We've been planning it for 3 weeks. I don't know if you could call it that, but it's going to be a lot less structured than our normal episodes. And not that our episodes are super tight, but basically, Roozbeh, I've been really excited to have you on, and we've been talking about this idea that you've been working on called the pedagogy of meanwhile for quite a while. I think it was at a conference maybe 2023, 2024. We were getting drinks and you were talking about it's just like this is going to be an amazing book project. So you were already going to be a guest. When the students and I were talking about this season of the podcast, I kept thinking you'd be a perfect guest, and you said yes, but we kept having to delay. And yeah, like professors are busy and family life is busy and this world is tough. But specifically, you're Iranian American and work with educators in Iran, and you're a professor at University of Minnesota, and you live in the Twin Cities. So for obvious reasons, we kept having to delay when we were going to do your episode. And simultaneously, I've been in all of these organizing meetings where people keep talking about this idea of, well, we're waiting and we're fighting while we wait, and we're building the next world while we struggle within this one. I was like, oh shit, this is the meanwhile. And we'll get into what that means, but all of that to say that we basically just said, fuck it, let's just do a quick, little planned, lightly edited episode that just leans into this. I'm not going to ask you to be the voice of the expert of Iran, of Minneapolis, but I think that the meanwhile offers this fantastic way to think about what it means to work and to struggle in this moment, especially for those of us living in the heart of empire. So all that to say, uh, it's good to see you, friend. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. It's great to be here. Likewise, I've been excited to join you here and to be able to talk with you about certainly some of the work that I've been doing, as you were mentioning earlier before. It's a funny moment in which being an Iranian academic in Minneapolis kind of puts you at the center of a lot of different Venn diagrams. So that's certainly something that's been going on. But I'm um, excited to think with you, and I think you and I have also over the years found that that's something that we both enjoy doing. And so to kind of step into something more unscripted with you just feels like hanging out. So let's jump into it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've been talking for 20 minutes, and I was like, oh shit, we should have been recording this whole time. So hopefully, the
Yeah.
things we were talking about offline, Imperial Boomerang, Palestine as a laboratory, all of that will come up. But before we get into the actual questions, can you maybe just situate listeners on who are you?
Yeah, so I'm faculty in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. Um, I'm in our comparative and international education program, and I have been at Minnesota now for 14 years last month. So I've spent some time here now where I've been able to do largely the work that I find to be interesting, and through that work kind of charting an itinerary of political questions that have led me to what my work is looking at here now. But just very briefly for your listeners, when I came here, I was just a couple of years out from my dissertation work in Jordan, where I was looking at schooling as a site for reimagining notions of national identity, refashioning Jordanianness, because I did my study in Jordan along the lines of an economic model that was being put forward by the government. And that was, in a sense, an abrupt shift just because that was breaking with a longer history of solidarity with Palestine as a form of pan-Arab nationalism that was going on there. The questions that really animated that work were just like, how do schools function to delimit what's possible politically, or what we can learn and what we can know about the political. And what was interesting about that project for me was just that I was drawn to the informal spaces from the start. Like I wasn't seeing in class conversations per se that allowed for the kind of deep or more substantive explorations of youth kind of assessing their own everyday lived conditions or teachers kind of like thinking with them in those processes. But that would happen in these informal spaces. But I was thinking, why don't I ask similar questions in a context where I'm more familiar and where I grew up? And so that's right around the time that I came to Minnesota. And I started thinking about, well, what does it actually mean to be American and how are those conversations structured in schools? So I ended up doing a project here in the Twin Cities, kind of a year-long ethnography across two schools, and really focusing on how students from who are minoritized and have transnational social lives. And this was kind of during that waning days of Obama's post-racial presidency. So there was a lot of self-congratulatory discourse about what it meant to be American and how Obama was kind of embodying this is a place where if you work hard, you can make it. And so some of the stories that were coming up from the youth participants in that project certainly pointed to something very different and the ways in which white supremacy, settler colonialism, and US imperialism are all, in a sense, palatable when it's in a more telegenic or let's say socially acceptable kind of like form, right? So we all see the memes. I think, well, I do certainly in my feed, but there's the meme of the distinguishing between the Democrats and the Republicans, where the Republicans are just a B-52 bomber, and then the Democrats are the B-52 bomber with like, an LGBTQ flag, a Black Lives Matter emblem.
I think back to this kind of nostalgia of how why can't we go back to invisibilizing empire and hiding all of that? But as you're pointing out with your youth participants, it was never invisibilized, right? It's still acted on certain people in the United States, and it's just more prevalent in this moment, an acceleration for everyone.
Right.
So maybe that's a good way of getting into. Could you just situate? I mentioned it like three times in my rambly intro, but what is this idea of the pedagogy of meanwhile?
Yeah, no, I think where I can start with that is so, pedagogy of the meanwhile, or now I'm calling it pedagogies. So this is the title of my current book project, as well as the key theoretical intervention that I'm developing to explore the possibilities of, in the context of this project, anti-colonial and anti-racist teaching and learning in increasingly illiberal political settings. So my project is based in France, where I began working with newcomer and refugee youth on a digital storytelling project back in 2018 through the 2018-2019 school year, and more recently have continued in dialogue with teachers who self-identify as anti-racist and anti-colonial. So the emergence of the idea is situated in that project, but I believe the concept of the meanwhile is applicable to a lot of scenarios and contextual settings. Kind of as a teaser, right, before like jumping in and defining it, I do think it's important to take a step back to kind of anchor this concept in um, the social meanings and practices that different social actors and institutions use to give some meaning and some structure to time. So this idea of temporality proposes a linear progression in order, right? So uh, something begins, something continues or has a middle, and all things eventually end. So multiple temporalities can exist at once. The notion of childhood or the experience of falling in or out of love, building a career, becoming educated, or more relevant to my work with my youth participants, becoming, quote unquote, integrated. So temporalities don't necessarily coexist harmoniously, nor are they experienced in the same way, because the social construction of time is like any other social construction, never far from systems of power and their ideologies and the specific techniques of regulation and assessment. And so time is itself a disciplinary mechanism and one that organizes institutional work. So here we can see that our experiences of time, like other experiences of the social world, are very much situated and shaped by context. How we use time or how our time is structured is going to be a technique of power, and one that's implicated in again governance structures. So when we speak about appropriate uses of time, for example, I'd say the subtext is that someone or an entity has the power to delineate the proper usage of time in a setting, right? To evaluate individual or collective activity within that temporal frame. And so the experiences of time constitute what we see as possible, right? Our experiences of social time help us to see what becomes possible in everyday life. So think, for example, about all the things that, you might want to do or that you think would be good to do that you don't have time for, right? I know for me that's, going to the gym, continuing to refine my French, having a more active social life, cooking healthy food from scratch, or just sitting and doing nothing, sleeping in. For parents, and I'm also a parent, thinking about quality time with your kids, whether that's reading together or making art together, playing together, or just having fun or practicing something. And then, I think about how much of that is actually possible or feasible. Thinking about how this lands in education. In most formal educational settings, there's an instructional timeline. The belief and expectation that all teachers should be instructing their students in such a way that, that they can demonstrate measurable growth from one lesson to the next, one unit to the next, or one grade to the next. And so educators also have these institutional norms and expectations that structure their pedagogical choices and approaches, what they decide to teach, and how that's structured by the need to stay on track or to stay on time. And so this is where I'm building towards this. I know I'm doing a lot of setup here, but where I'm going with this is that educators struggles for time for building affirming classroom relationships or for open-ended study or for co-construction of knowledge, for unlearning or for different kind of modes of advocacy are both really important, right? They're vital for deep critical inquiry, and they're continuously constrained. They're constrained by accountability regimes, by techniques of institutional surveillance, by various encroachments on their time. And so in my kind of work, what I'm seeing is that the time of educators is increasingly a kind of a terrain of neoliberal governance and professional assessment, staying on time, keeping up, not falling behind. All of these understandings suggest how temporality is implicated in self-regulation and disciplinary techniques and in governance orders. Because being on time entails reordering and delimiting thought, what you see as possible, what you want to do. And so given that, I'd argue that rethinking time and pedagogical labor across time then represents a really important, necessary, and possibly still under-examined political move in epistemic labor, right? Because when we're talking about the meanwhile, we're talking about kind of the between the injustices and struggles of the present, right? And maybe the more humane, less violent futures of justice or dignity and equity that many of us long for. That's that temporal expanse. And between kind of where we are now and what we're trying to build in the future, that's what I'm calling the meanwhile.
Even just in your answer, that I think I called this an emergency episode at the top, and I think people might be wanting that like direct causal, well, okay, Roozbeh is going to teach us what to do right now. And we can't meander about and think in these open ways, but that's trying to trap this notion of time and productivity into these very rigid causal outcome based modes. I do have a one thing that popped in my head, which is I don't want to share too much, but I've been doing trying to get in the way of ice. And I know what you're talking about is how temporality is governed as a structure. But it was really funny that a lot of this work involves a few of us standing 2 feet away from a bunch of ice agents. And just the other day, one of them said to us, "Is this a good use of your time?" And I mean, it is like there were no community members around. It ended up just being like a bunch of like grungy lefties and gross fascists standing next to each other for hours. And it's like, I don't know what was done during that time. I think a lot, but we'll hold off on that. So I was thinking of these kind of
I
buckets that,
love that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what are we doing with our time? So I wonder if we could get into some kind of like the buckets that I was noticing you talking about. So one is schooling. One is this notion of utopia, because I think there's a very utopian notion of the meanwhile being the on the way towards. And the other is this notion of urgency. So maybe we could take those one by one. What does the meanwhile have to do with schooling? Or what does it look like in schooling structures?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I was a K-12 teacher before I got into this side of things. I was a first grade teacher in Jersey City. And so I think anyone who has worked as a teacher has heard some version of the expression that this is what they want, and then I close my classroom door and then I do what I want, or that's when the learning actually begins. I mean, people do different things with that type of expression. So I don't think on the one hand it's introducing something that no one has considered before. Rarely is that the case. It's just giving us a new frame to think about and theorize, I think, practices that are already there. To answer your question a little bit more directly, I'd have to tell you more about just kind of like the actual classrooms and spaces where I was spending time in France. I ended up working in these classrooms for French language learners, which are commonly referred to as the UPEDUSA classes. So that's the Unit pédagogique pour les élèves nouvelles arrivantes allophones. So that's the two A's. But what that means is basically a classroom for newcomer students who don't speak French, similar to like an EL classroom where it's a similar kind of intent where this is a space for students to emphasize English language acquisition, or in this case, French language acquisition, so that they can then progress academically and become mainstream to facilitate their learning, right? So language is kind of a prerequisite for normative academic achievement. I think in many schools, certainly the ones that I observed in Minnesota, these UPEDUSA classes often, but not always, kind of exist on the margins of most French schools. The students themselves are kind of in this liminal place where it's just like you're here, but you're not really a student. You need to learn French first. So they are rendered or made visible differently than the rest of students there. And so yeah, they occupy this liminal social position, which constrains their relationships, I would say, with monolingual peers, really informs how other teachers engage with them. And oftentimes it's from a place of deficit and derision, because the expectation is that these students in UPEDUSA will likely struggle until they learn French well enough to progress. So in that sense, these classrooms were kind of seen as waiting rooms, if you will, for like students to learn French well enough in order to begin to be able to have the possibility to learn. Because of its kind of subordinate standing within the broader school landscape, these classrooms were often seen by the general population of students and other kind of content area teachers as afterthoughts. They're not particularly well supported. The support is uneven. And so this is kind of where I think it becomes interesting for us to pivot back to this idea of the meanwhile, because it's, in the absence of standardized practices, in the absence of ongoing surveillance, or the same thing where you're saying like you walk in, there's like maybe this whole school reform model that like a school in the Bronx or in Jersey City or wherever else has adopted that kind of standardized practices and units and the pedagogical engagements. UPEDUSA doesn't really have that. So there's this space of possibility, of indeterminacy that comes with that liminal standing that I was talking about. So I think that creates the possibilities of a different kind of learning, a different space for learning for racialized newcomer students. And so, if we depart from the idea, as I do, that integration has is both an ideological and temporal project, then the kinds of anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogy that we were enacting in those classrooms and later teachers talk about enacting in their classrooms in many ways kind of constitute this counter-hegemonic temporal praxis, right? Like you were saying before, it's an invitation to slow down, to pause, to question, and to look beyond kind of this normative timeline to consider what's happening kind of in their own lives or what they're wrestling with. So I think that project that I was working with students, in particular the digital storytelling project, created openings for precisely this kind of temporal and political work. It refers to in a way of making use of the absence of structures, and in some cases, a rerouting or a commandeering of structures towards different pedagogical aims, and when you have clear political commitments as an educator, that rerouting of time, that taking of time, then becomes an intervention in and of itself, in that you're creating space for something that otherwise can exist or there is literally no time for in the classroom.
It sounds like you're talking about there being conditions to the meanwhile. And does that mean that it's part of an undercommons? Is it possible for anyone? I'm thinking about also you started that answer by talking about your own teaching experience. Sorry, I'm forgetting. Were you, I think you were a teacher in Jersey City on 9/11 or the next year? Was that your first year of
No, I
teaching?
was I was there. So my
Yeah.
teaching was kind of bookended around that. So in a sense,
Yeah.
again, that experience is very, very relevant.
I think I'm just wondering like what yeah, what as I said, what the conditions are and possibly like does 9/11 make I don't want to draw too much on Agamben, but like this state of exception.
Right. I don't think it's a particular response to an event. I mean, when we think about kind of the political commitments that are there, if we're talking about like an anti-colonial, and I'm for now leaning more towards anti-colonial rather than decolonial. That's maybe a different conversation. But when we think about coloniality, right, as a structure, um, or we think about settler colonialism, or we think about imperialism, it's not useful for us analytically, I think, to reduce these to events. So, like, what as spectacular as the events are, whether it's the kidnapping of Maduro or the preemptive bombing of Iran or the appearance of 3,000 agents on the streets of your city to completely disregard any pretense of constitutional protections or laws, and dispensing with warrants, dispensing with the Fourth Amendment, dispensing with First Amendment rights of assembly and rights. You can watch people go, you can stand. That's not impeding in an investigation. As I think a lot of activists are kind of talking amongst themselves about, like, how do we do this in such a way to disrupt without actually and still be able to make claims to rightful presence or the legality of presence that are there, or shredding even the Second Amendment. Like, Alex Preddy was a licensed gun owner. He had a concealed carry permit. So we're in a setting where we're seeing things that are spectacle, right? Of cruelty or violence or of control of power that's there, can be the impetus for mobilizing a lot of people. But, surges, we're in like 2 months plus now. I'm hoping that this doesn't keep going indefinitely. But protest movements, certainly, they don't last forever. Even something like September 11th, it was like a morning, and a very consequential morning, but a morning nonetheless, right? So I don't think that we're necessarily reacting to events. I think when we have a larger analytical regard or trajectory that we're working with, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a moment of like heightened tension in order to be able to, again, enact this type of counter-hegemonic temporality, or to kind of think about ways in which to reroute or commandeer the use of time towards a kind of learning that is ethical and necessary and not structurally possible.
Hmm. I am left wondering that really clarifies things. I do wonder, though, it sounds like there are curricular and material structures that allowed at least the schools you're working in France to seize time in a different way and to, as you said, commandeer it. That maybe the conditions were this openness, this indeterminate space, this lack of eyeballs and surveillance on kind of like giving those kids aren't yet quote unquote students, right? All they have to do is learn French and then they can become educable. Yeah. So can the meanwhile pop up anywhere, or does it need some kind of subterranean something?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I'm probably not going to be able to give a definitive answer one way or another right now. I think rather than to insist on its modularity and its transferability, like a pop-up, that's kind of what comes to mind when you're phrasing the question in that way. I think that there's always latent opportunities for us to be able to tap into in order to be able to intervene in a hegemonic politics. And I actually think that when we talk about the meanwhile, is it necessarily having room for a year-long digital storytelling project? No, I don't think so. I think it can be enacted in kind of the small and everyday practices, but that it accumulates. That's the important thing, that there's an aggregation, I think, that has constitutive effects over time. And I think in talking with teachers who about their own classroom practices, like the ways in which they intervene in, let's say, for example, highly racialized notion of national identity in France, or in a sense, insisting on a particular kind of universalist script of membership in France that doesn't accommodate or leave any room for articulating or naming the kinds of hypocrisies and contradictions of universalist political membership in France. So there's not really a modularity of practice here, what we see, but there is a response that challenges kind of this directive to incite a particular kind of loyalty, or at least demonstration of allegiance to a particular set of symbols of the state. So I don't know if that really gets to your point or not, but that came to mind for me as I was thinking about your question.
No, for me, that really clarifies it. And I think you've been talking about this concept with depth and nuance and building on extensive research, which, as we've talked about, leans into the intentional slowness here, which I think is what podcasts have to be, right? You're not going to have like the urgency and the outcome-based focus of a podcast to be like, after this hour, the meanwhile will ignite the revolution for our 10 listeners. But I think as we tease this out, it does bring me back to the big idea of doing this as like a let's just do it, which is like how can the meanwhile inform us in this moment? I was really thinking about was I've been in a lot of organizing meetings, obviously, as so many of us have, and we had this one about like organizing our neighborhood, which hasn't had a ton of ICE activity and is also it's a neighborhood with a long history of gentrification. And people were immediately saying things like, actually, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And like, we shouldn't be canvassing neighbors when the majority of us in this space are white. And it became this really interesting back and forth. What people ended up talking about is, oh, maybe what we should be doing is getting to know each other, getting to know our community members, and we should be building something else. And it's like, what is happening in this moment is making possible something longer, right? It's not just in this moment, what are we doing today, tomorrow, and all that, but how are we building another project? And it was emerging from the possibility of um, this kind of alternative space. But all of that to say, like, all of this urgency, what does the meanwhile offer in this moment?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. And I'm not going to answer it head on because as you were talking, I had a couple other thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think one of the things that's really important is that, exactly to your point, even the example about like people trying to organize and people trying to mobilize, like that in and of itself is really like demanding work right now. And if you think about it, that's indicative of kind of our present political condition, that we can live in a neighborhood and really not know anyone beyond the person who's immediately across the hall from us or directly next door to us, right? Such that trying to convene and organize as a block or as a neighborhood doesn't really have like an intuitive feel to it, right? And I think that's indicative of the fact that we're living these really, again, over saturated lives where everyone, I think a lot about Berlant's work on cruel optimism. And this is really one of the things that has stayed with me is that everyone is putting so much energy into trying to make it, into just trying to live, that there's not any energy or imagination left to ask what else might be possible, what else could there be beyond this. And so there is that attrition that's happening there, which is very much at play here. But I also think that certainly among seasoned organizers, and I don't count myself as a seasoned organizer. I've done organizing in the past. I've shown up to actions and things like that, but by no means did I make this the prime directive of my activity or my livelihood. But I think for people who are in that, I think they have a much more expansive view of building power and building counter-hegemonic kind of possibility. And it's not in the work of, again, the emergency or the response to the spectacle, right? The response to the spectacular. That mobilizes a lot of people, but just as quickly as that happens, people go back to their ordinary lives, or it becomes kind of more of a I did that. And then for some folks, I did that and nothing happened. Therefore, I'm falling into this kind of superficial political awareness that's characterized by cynicism and thin commitments. And as I'm kind of like responding to you, um, I think I'm probably articulating some of or staking some additional terrain for this. But the possibility of rethinking our own timeframes for political transformation is, I think, what's key, right? That this involves labor that does not necessarily bear fruit, that there's not a linear correspondence to if I do this, if I do A, then B will happen. And I think that's just the default setting for most of us in certainly in this society because it's very much kind of like you have to do this, you have to be goal oriented. If you don't work for this, then X will never happen. And so again, that is kind of like an organizing principle of life in late capitalist fascist America, that like you put your effort where you get results. And I think we're not habituated to that. I think it's actively kind of like taken from us that like or we're discouraged in thinking about our time or our investments in time as kind of in aggregate, a collective and non-owned, non-proprietary kind of notion of transformation or change, right? Where I might be doing something, and again, I don't necessarily see the effects of my action in real time in this kind of like very transactional form of I showed up to the protest, I stopped ice this morning. I'm good. Like we don't have to worry about it anymore. So when I think about the meanwhile and when I think about what it's inviting us to do, is to kind of take a longer lens on kind of political transformation and the need for a little bit more of a recognition of the fact that there's not this kind of like transactional correspondence between what you put in and what you get out. And again, I think anyone who spent any time in real organizing work is going to say, yeah, basically, that's organizing 101. You don't show up and expect things to change just because you went to a protest or you made a no king sign. I've been thinking a lot about this work, and there's an Iranian sociologist whose work I admire and whose work that I've been reading for some time, going back to graduate school. And this is the work of Asif Bayat. And he has been writing about life as everyday politics and playing with this idea of social non-movements. And so what he's getting us to consider is that, again, like the political transformations, that social movement theory often posits that contentious politics are ways of kind of making demands on the state and forcing demands from maybe outside of like formal channels. The critique there is that if we look at the forms of political transformation that he studies, and the work that he was carrying out largely was situated within Egypt, he's talking about the everyday encroachment of the ordinary. And I love that line because it refers to the fact that like what we're doing every day, and he's referring to the fact that like in Cairo, for example, you have, because of like rural to urban migration, you have people who are moving to Cairo in order to pursue opportunity for any number of reasons, coerced migration, whether, just for an economic livelihood. But for whatever reasons this migration is happening, is people who are coming to um, the edges of Cairo who might not have the means to um, get a house or an apartment that has electricity or has this or has all these kind of like trappings or conveniences of modern urban life, just kind of build. They might reroute power from an existing line. They do the kind of work of the gray market where they are informal or unlicensed kind of vendors of certain goods. And over time, that acquires its own gravity or heft, such that without there being a direct confrontation with the state, now the state can't necessarily uproot this critical mass of people who have constituted, a neighborhood informally and without official sanction. And to me, I think that that's the metaphor that I think about here a lot in terms of what the meanwhile is and how it works, is that we do the things that we do. We don't necessarily seek permission to do the work that we do most of the time because that's a losing proposition, or it's presented to us in such a way of, if you do all the other things that you need to do, then possibly maybe you can do this. And so there's an individuality, a kind of a cellularity of action, of potential here, that I think is really important to think about, that an aggregate does end up having these constitutive effects. And so whether or not we can document that empirically, that's not where I am in the work, and not really a place where I think I'm going to really fully endeavor to be. But I think that it constitutes a shift, of that kind of epistemic shift, that I think is necessary for being able to remain engaged politically in the everyday, and to remain engaged in a counter-hegemonic or an anti-oppressive or anti-fascist or anti-colonial or anti-racist politics, without the expectation that I did the thing and then the change happened. What I think this proposes is that we all have something to do in building the world that we want to see, which is again a less violent, a less oppressive world, a world less openly and nakedly skewed to benefit a very small minority of people at the expense of a um, great majority of us. That this is ongoing labor, right? And that this is something that we do not for the sake of necessarily obtaining, right? But more for the sake of contributing. And it's that kind of like collective claim making, that collective labor, that I think gives us really something to strive for. And Minneapolis is a really good, I think, case study of that right now. I've gotten a lot of messages from friends, not just across the US, but internationally, who are just like, holy shit, you guys are doing it. And I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's the fact that everyday people are mobilizing, whether it's wearing whistles or following, or like having kind of these like paper mache puppets that are staged in parks, or the kind of carnivalesque kind of elements of it, to the more kind of direct confrontational actions that we see as well too. Like you're seeing people mobilize and bring to this kind of condition immeasurable amount of actions and intent and affect, which is palpable, which, you can see. And I think that there's tremendous potential in that. And that's what I'm trying to flesh out, both in this project and in other work that I'm doing.
I think two things that I want to hit on that you're talking about are one, that this is collective work, right? Both for the broader struggle and specifically what you're talking about with the meanwhile, it seems like it has to be a collective project. And it also seems like it is I don't know if you would say direct, unsanctioned. I'm just thinking of the very famous David Graeber example of protest is what was it like going to the mayor king going to somebody's house and saying may we dig a well or we ask that you dig a well. Direct action is getting together, digging the well, and daring them to stop you. And it sounds like that's deeply relevant for the meanwhile. And maybe to get back to the earlier question I asked, that those are the conditions of the meanwhile, is that it must have those things. It must be collective. It must be enacted by people without kind of this representational. Anyway, I want to ask one more question if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because this has just been like, for me, it's been just a cool conversation, learning, I've heard a ton about this project, but like learning a new angle of it and thinking about it within this current moment. I don't know how necessarily relevant that is to this podcast. This season is supposed to be, what does education actually do? Right? How does education actually function in the world? So I wonder if we could maybe bring your work, which is of course relevant to that, and you're answering that question with all of your work. So like when you think of the meanwhile, like what is education doing? What is the force of education? Is it, I don't want to be so ridiculous as to say like good, bad, but is it a moral force? Is it doing something else?
Um, I always balk at the term moral.
Yeah, I
Because
went with don't do
I am
good, bad, just
staunchly
do
second.
moral. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
do, do good.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Education is hope. To get
Children
back
are
to
the
our Obama
future, and
love. Yeah.
education is hope. No, I mean, and sometimes like we can smuggle in all these other things under kind of the rubric of these like larger kind of nondescript sayings, right? And there's something subversive and fun about that too. I think the meanwhile, if you're asking me like, what does it do for education? I, I'm going to limit it right now to thinking about what can it do? How does it respond to kind of the unraveling and kind of constricting of formal schooling? Is how I'll answer that question. And I think that it allows for some hopefully unconstricting, and I think it allows for some challenge of directives and a type of education that is premised on producing good workers, productive, overly busy people who, again, to go back to Berlin, don't have the time or energy to think or imagine anything else. And so to be able to create space for a kind of a collective engagement or collective questioning of something that implicates us all, that we are the water that we swim in and yet we're not allowed to name or to let alone to kind of discuss, is really powerful. And I think that it creates kind of the opportunities that carry beyond just kind of the work that educators do with students, right? Because it can lead to students having conversations with one another or organizing, educators talking with one another and organizing. One of the things that was meant to happen with my project in France, because as I said kind of at the top, that this was happening between 2018 2019, and I'd written up like a whole part two to this project. So we were going to do the short films with the students, that they were going to produce their narratives. And then I had lined up commitments from the National Immigration History Museum in Paris to like screen the films and do like a panel with some of the student filmmakers, like a talk, like an event, right? I'd lined up a commitment from University of Paris 8, the Seine Saint-Denis campus, with a colleague there who was like, "Yeah, come through, talk to our faculty and our sociology doc students about the work you did and why." So I think there are all kinds of ways in which the work can travel beyond what we do in the immediate classroom. So I don't want to just talk about it as kind of like this is a how to teach or what to do within the classroom, because in the spirit of again thinking about aggregate effects and things kind of moving beyond their maybe initial or intended space, I think that all comes with this. And again, that's a harder thing to anticipate and to measure. But I think if we're starting from the place that the types of claims that we make on institutional time matter, they have to be enacted collectively. And when they are enacted collectively, they become a collective frame of reference for future engagements and for future claim making. And so I would hope that again, I think for many listeners, especially people who are thinking about anti-racist pedagogies or who are thinking about critical pedagogy more broadly, would say, yeah, this sounds really familiar, and I hope it is, right? Because it kind of I come out of a similar tradition. You know, you mentioned Freire and kind of a dialogical process. Like I have studied that. That's had its influence, and I'm not claiming that that's what this is, but I think that there is a kind of a intelligibility, right, across what I'm proposing that emerges from this work in France with the kinds of things that we see happening elsewhere. And the important piece, I think, to make sure that I want to share with people is, you know, I mentioned that this is happening in increasingly illiberal political context. And when I was initially writing, I just felt like the conversation in France was so much more restricted than when it was in the US. And in that, it's not possible to speak openly of systemic racism in France, right? That such a thing is really seen as a non-starter because of the purported universalism and the Republican values that enshrine universalism as a condition of political life in France. And so when you are taking away the tools and the vocabulary and the frames that folks need to be able to make sense of their lives, to take that back and to do so without permission, again, to commandeer that, I think is important. And that's already responding to a need that's there. So the meanwhile can both kind of allow for us to envision something new, but it does also give us a space to think differently and to approach current conditions differently and most importantly, collectively.